In this episode, we are going to talk about the moderates, the early Congress leadership, which had often been criticized for their moderation by their critics from within the government or from amongst their opposition in the nationalist movement. In the first place, what we know as the moderate phase of Indian politics or nationalist politics is basically the early phase when the Congress was trying to build up the nucleus of its organization. As you know, that the Congress, when it met in 1885, was designed mainly as a conference, and it didn't have a very solid organizational structure. The subjects committee decided on the questions that they were going to deliberate in the Congress, and finally, in the annual session, these matters came up for discussion among a select body of men, not very large in number, who deliberated on some of the critical issues concerning Indian representation or Indian poverty, the prospects of material and moral progress, development. So, this is basically suggesting a phase in Indian politics, but the term moderate was something that was given to them by their critics for the kind of circumspection that they had shown in adopting a more combative political strategy against imperial rule. They were moderates because they were constitutionalists. They preferred to petition the government. They preferred to rely on the gentle policy of persuading the government to undertake the more tangible political reforms. They were content with opening a dialogue with the bureaucracy. Despite the many instances of racial arrogance that they had suffered, they were not willing to get rid of British rule altogether, and to the extent that they were happy to function within the imperial system, they were often labeled as loyalists. So the term moderate came from the criticism of such practices or such political methods that the early Congress leadership had adopted. And much of this criticism came from a group of nationalists who, during the course of the 1890s, would suggest an alternative mobilization.
Sir, what was the ideological context of such moderate attitude towards imperialism?
This ideological context acquires significance, and I think it's a very important question for one to address while talking about moderate politics, is that the moderates represented what may be called Indian liberalism. This emphasis that I put on Indian liberalism as distinct from militant nationalism of the 1890s, from whose pejorative characterization of the early Congress leaders came this idea about these people as moderates. Now, these Indian liberals felt that for the Indians to be ready for participating in self-government, participating in representative government, what the Indian society needed was enlightenment, education. I mean, unless you create an educated public, there was less likelihood of the public becoming discreet citizens. So, it was not very distinctively Indian moderate practice. I mean, liberals all over the world were actually thinking in terms of creating an enlightened public before the public was actually given political entitlement. So it is also important that many of these early Congress leaders who have been described as moderates, men like Gokhale, for example, or Surendranath Banerjee in Bengal, they were all associated with educational projects. Surendranath Banerjee, as you know, was the founder of Ripon College, which eventually became Surendranath College. Gopal Krishna Gokhale was associated with the Deccan Education Society, with Ferguson College. So education was high on their agenda, and it was English education. They were acting on the assumption that exposure to English education would create a liberal and secular society. the commitment to secularism or the vision of a secular society cannot be questioned, because you know that in the early days of the Congress, thanks to this kind of liberal influence, and they very deliberately adopted a minority clause which actually prevented any discussion on issues which were likely to create divisions among communities. So if, for example, the Muslim delegates had objected to the discussion on a certain question on grounds of their religious sensibilities being hurt, the Congress would avoid this discussion. This was also a very useful strategy for them to adopt in a situation or in a society where there were so many divisions, linguistic, ethnic, communal, regional. So the idea for them was to create a kind of united front at one level, but this united front against imperialism required to be supported adequately by a certain kind of liberal politics, liberalization program, which actually involved a whole range of social reform programs as well. So it was not unusual for many of these moderates to support a fairly comprehensive social reform program. And in Maharashtra, for example, these early Congress leaders came from the Prarthana Samaj background. They were thinking in terms of comprehensive social change by way of adopting Western values or westernizing reforms. Similar was the approach of Surendranath Banerjee as well. I mean, if you look at the 1890s, during the debate on whether the government was correct or right in interfering in a social custom like marriage. You know, in 1891-92, a law was proposed to raise the marriageable age of women to 12, and it created a major controversy all over India. In Bengal, a continuous press war actually took place between Sanjeevani, which was a newspaper controlled by the Brahmas, which aligned with Surendranath Banerjee, and against Bangabashi. Bangabashi was the representative of the orthodox opinion, and among these orthodox supporters of the idea of a complete insulation of Indian society from any kind of intervention by an alien state, Bangabashi actually upheld a very conservative position. It is also important that many of the critiques of these moderates, like Tilak, for example, in Maharashtra, in fact, were also critiques of such kinds of intervention by the colonial state in social customs. So you can see a very important ideological divide. In Maharashtra, you have the Prarthana Samaj inheritance or legacy, which fed into the early Congress visions, the moderate vision, so to say. You have the Brahmo group in Bengal, which was aligned with Surendranath Banerjee, and they were ranged against the more orthodox elements among the nationalists, whose idea was the comprehensive rejection of the West. Any kind of westernization was unacceptable. And it was with such people that the militant nationalists, during the course of the 1890s, became aligned, and they, in a way, was the ideological counterpoint to the kind of liberal nationalism that the moderates represented.
What was the nature of the alternative mobilization that the critic of the moderates undertook?
Partly your question is answered through the reference that I was making to the agitation caused by the consent bill. Those who actually stood against this kind of intervention by the alien state were thinking in terms of a different kind of mobilization which would be more nationalistic, which would not look to the West, unlike the moderates who thought that West had something to give to us. I mean, liberalization program of theirs was largely indebted to inspiration of Western liberalism. So, as an alternative mobilization, these people would look back to Indian history or to Indian religion, for example. Tilak, for example, would organize Ganapati festival and popularize it, which was basically a family festival of the Peshwas, and suddenly it would become a kind of a public festival in order to use it as a kind of locus, a kind of center of mobilization. So the alternative mobilization was using a language which was very dominated by religious imagery. It had its dangerous implications, but we shall talk about it on a later occasion. My point is that while we actually call the early nationalists to order for being moderate in their practices, one has to have some sympathy for them. One has to consider that even at that stage the national movement had not been able to create a kind of a popular base. The national movement had just begun to grow, hadn't yet acquired an organization of a powerful kind. So it is in this context that the emphasis on opening a dialogue had its use. The manner in which they wished to persuade the government to undertake certain tangible reforms so that Indians were represented in decision-making bodies. The reform of the legislature would actually open up opportunities for Indians to exert a certain degree of influence on critical decision-making, critical legislative processes. They would like to be represented in the major administrative institutions. So, if you look at this early stage of nationalism and look at the way the strategies were worked out by these moderate nationalists in order to achieve certain tangible reforms, I think that the methods that they had approved, despite their limitations, had a certain degree of relevance, at a certain degree of use at the time when they had been employed. Particularly when we see that the kind of alternative mobilization that had been emerging during the 1890s through the kind of connection that some of the critics of the early moderate nationalists were trying to forge with Hindu populism proved to be a very divisive factor in Indian politics in the later decades. If the methods were not combative enough, the ideology that these early nationalists were trying to espouse, the creation of a liberal society, an enlightened society, a kind of secular society, these are something the value of which was increasingly realized as time went by. But in addition to this, there is something more about the moderates which had been a major subject of discussion among historians. It relates to the very limited social base. It has been suggested that the liberalism that they espoused was so anglicized, so indebted to the European ideological or educational inheritance, that they were unable to use a language of politics which would be able to breach their distance with the people. The people were not represented adequately in the Congress, in the early phase at least. It was basically an outfit of the educated elites, people who are members of the high caste. So one historian like John Broomfield would describe the Bhadralok, who I would say that the Bhadralok constituted one of the important sections of the early Congress leadership Broomfield makes. And he suggests that the whole domination of the Bhadralok was domination of caste tempered with English education. So you have an English educated elite which is capable of using the language of the alien rulers, but which at the same time was incapable of using a political language that would be able to bridge their gap, bridge their distance from the people. That is one kind of criticism leveled against the Congress, partly because of the kind of limited social base that the early Congress actually had. It was limited to the professional classes. They met annually, and once they dispersed from that annual session, the Congress went into hibernation. So there were criticisms of this kind of practice by early congressmen from within the Congress itself. Din Shawacha, for example, who was one of the early leaders of the Congress, complained of the fact that many of these lawyers who were so vociferous in their criticism of the un-British character of British rule would go to hibernation throughout the year. It is only during the Congress session they would be found to be active. So the social basis of the Congress had its own limitations. One has to recognize this while we acknowledge the very important contribution that early nationalism made to the liberal legacy of Indian nationalism. But while acknowledging this important legacy, you have to admit that the early Congress had a limited social base. I have just explained this limited social base in terms of the domination of the professional classes, especially the lawyers. Some people say, as I have quoted Broomfield, that it's domination of caste tempered with education, because the high caste of Bengal, the Chitwavan elite of Maharashtra, the Kayasthas and the Kashmiri Brahmins of northern India, the Kayasthas of Telugu country, Andhra region, the Tamil Brahmins, all of these caste groups which are high caste, which were very powerful and influential as service people, they were the professional people who continued to dominate the Congress. And it is on this ground, the early Congress has often been criticized as Vakil Raj or as Brahmin club, or if you may use the words of Dufferin in a moment of great expectation of an imminent collapse of the Congress said the Congress was a microscopic minority.
Excuse me, sir. How far is this characterization of the Congress as a microscopic minority valid?
That is a very important question. On the face of it is valid. If you look at the men who would meet in the Congress and deliberate on issues which very directly affected the middle classes, Indianization of services, equal opportunities for Indians to find entry into the high civil services, the covenanted civil services, was basically a middle class demand. The assertion of their right to participate in decision-making processes was once again a demand of the educated classes. If you look at, for example, the manner in which only the professionals would figure prominently as Congress leaders, this characterization is valid. But this characterization actually ignores the fact that many of these Congress leaders, some of them were very important lawyers in the provincial high courts or in the district courts. They had their own bar associations which acted as a kind of a link between the Congress leadership in the provinces and the local influential lawyers who would be participating in the Congress or holding provincial conferences as it became a practice at the turn of the century. So these people had a wider clientele. There are local studies of early nationalism. For example, you have very interesting work on Allahabad by Chris Bailey, who has argued, who has shown that many of the local congressmen, Congress leaders of Allahabad, who would be very high-class lawyers, or would certainly have connections with the larger society. A teacher has his students. The lawyers have his clients. So it was not as if that these people were so isolated from the society that they had no connection with the larger society. As lawyers, they had their own linkages and connections. So this is a point which has to be borne in mind. But more than this, what I think is more important for us to recognize is that despite such limitations, the Congress in its early stage, or the moderates, were able to espouse and articulate certain demands, certain interests, which were capable of creating a kind of national consensus on questions of poverty, on questions of development. They were obsessed with the idea of how India had become progressively poor under British rule. This preoccupation with poverty had led them to criticisms against British rule for keeping India industrially backward. You look at the record. R.C. Dutt, for example, who was a civil servant but later on became the president of the Congress in one of his sessions, wrote the famous economic history, but before that he had wrote other tracts in which he criticized the British for inflicting on the peasants a so high a revenue demand that had been responsible for mass rural poverty.
Sir, all this is acceptable, but how far did the early congressmen succeed in undertaking popular mobilization, or if they failed, what was the reason behind that?
Yes, I will come to that. This is a very important question. But undertaking popular mobilization is another level of analysis, where certainly the early Congress failed. But to continue that, the other part of the discussion, that if you look at the manner in which they were actually trying to persuade the government to adopt a more protective policy towards Indian industries, concerns a certain vision of India's development whereby the poverty that had struck India with the high revenue demand would be somewhat removed by industrialization. For example, the whole thesis of deindustrialization, which was spun out from early nationalist vision of India's development, indicted British with the charge of destroying local industries without actually creating any possibility of an alternative modern industrialization. So I think that there is an element of altruism which can go along with the views of Professor Bipan Chandra, that there was an element of altruism in this kind of such postures, despite the fact that they were laissez-faire or they were admirers of liberal economics, that they were supporters of Indian capitalism. With regard to the question that you have raised about their failure to undertake popular mobilization, with which we shall try to wind up this discussion, certainly they failed. There were attempts by, for example, Alan Octavian Hume, who had been continuously appointed the General Secretary of the Congress on the assumption that through him the Congress would be able to open the dialogue with the white ruling class more effectively. Alan Octavian Hume soon realized after the foundation of the Congress that unless a broad-based popular mobilization had been undertaken, Congress would not be able to put as much pressure on the colonial state as was needed to extract tangible political reforms. So in 1887, Veer Raghavacharya, a very close associate of Hume, wrote a pamphlet, and it was translated into 12 languages, circulated in the rural areas, mainly in Western India, which complained about the fact that British rule had a pernicious effect on Indian agriculture by raising the high revenue demand. So as long as British revenue policy was the target of attack, there was no problem. But this was not likely to be the only locus of mobilization, but once you actually effective popular mobilization, inevitably this would go against indigenous classes, moneylenders or landlords. So when there were attempts to undertake cadastral survey during the 1890s in Bengal to record the rights of the tenants, there was opposition from the Congress. So whenever there were legislations enacted against the transfer of land to the moneylenders, for example, Punjab Land Alienation Bill of 1899, that was criticized by the Congress as a kind of artificial intervention in the normal market relationship between creditors and peasants. On the same ground, they would not be actually happy with the tenancy legislation, which they believed would interfere in the relationship between the tenants and the zamindars. So there was opposition to such measures from within the Congress. In Bengal, there were small landowners who were not always very rich, who were apprehensive of the fact that many of these tenancy legislations were going to deprive them of the small rental income that they were earning. Whatever be the reason, there was opposition because of the kind of rentier interest that had been important in the Congress. In Punjab, many of these congressmen were townsmen, urban people, traders linked with money lending interests, and they didn't approve of the idea that there should be a law against the passing of land or the alienation of land from peasants to moneylenders, because otherwise the money lending system would collapse. If the moneylenders were not able to get a court decree to attach the land of the debtor, their business was going to suffer. So I think that this remains a major limitation of the Congress, the failure to undertake popular mobilization. Hume actually tried to circulate these pamphlets all over India, but in 1888 in the Allahabad Congress, there was resistance to it. In 1892, Hume left India and then from England tried to impress upon his followers in India to undertake this kind of mobilization. But once again, there was a formal resolution taken in the Congress where clearly the Congress leadership tried to dissociate from any such measures of peasant mobilization. So I think in the early Congress, this remains one of the major weaknesses. And these weaknesses, as you know, would be somewhat resolved in the 1920s with Gandhian mobilization. But all said and done, one has to concede this point that the liberal legacy that moderate nationalism had left behind remains important in our history. And we should hark back to that legacy at a time when there are so many divisions, or at a time when many kinds of divisions were affecting national unity.